Judge William Robertson was known for his ruthless decisions and unwavering authority in the courtroom. He prided himself on never showing weakness and believed that justice should be swift and severe. Today, another case was on his desk. A young man named Derek Jones, accused of theft and assault. Derek sat in the defendant's chair, hands trembling. He maintained his innocence, but the prosecution painted him as a dangerous criminal. His lawyer? A frail, elderly man named Thomas Henderson. As Mr. Henderson slowly walked to the center of the courtroom, Judge Robertson smirked. "Are you sure you're in the right place, old man?" the judge sneered. "Or did you mistake this for a retirement home?" The courtroom chuckled, but Mr. Henderson remained calm. "I may be old, Your Honor," he said, voice steady, "but I have not forgotten what justice means." Judge Robertson rolled his eyes. "Proceed before you fall asleep." What happened next would change the judge's life forever. Mr. Henderson began his defense with calculated precision. "The prosecution claims that Mr. Jones was caught stealing," he said, "but I have here a statement from a witness who says otherwise." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Robertson frowned. "And this so-called witness?" he asked. Mr. Henderson gestured towards an elderly woman in the back row. "Mrs. Parker saw the entire incident," he said. "She will testify that Derek Jones was not the one who committed the crime." The judge's expression darkened. "This is a waste of time," he muttered. "We have all the evidence we need." But as Mrs. Parker spoke, the mood in the courtroom shifted. She described how the real thief, a man in a red jacket, ran past Derek, throwing the stolen goods at his feet. Derek had picked them up in shock, just as the police arrived. The jury listened intently. Judge Robertson, however, seemed unmoved. "You expect us to believe this?" he scoffed. "An old woman's word against clear police reports?" Mr. Henderson did not flinch. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out an old case file. "This is where it gets interesting," he said, placing it on the judge's desk. Judge Robertson glanced at it, and his blood ran cold. The old file was worn and yellowed with time. The judge's hands trembled slightly as he read the name on the cover. Case No. 1987-3421 Defendant, William Robertson Attorney, Thomas Henderson. The courtroom was silent. Everyone watched the judge's reaction. This can't be," Judge Robertson whispered. Mr. Henderson met his gaze. "Do you remember now, William?" The judge's breathing grew heavy. His mind raced back decades. He had once been a young law student, accused of fraud. Everyone had turned against him. Everyone, except for one man. Thomas Henderson. Judge Robertson swallowed hard. How could I have forgotten?" Mr. Henderson gave a small smile. "Power makes people forget their pasts." Judge Robertson felt his heart stop for a moment when he saw his own name on the cover of the file. A large, old legal file. Its pages were yellowed, its corners worn. But the words written on it were still clear. Case No. 1987-3421. Defendant, William Robertson. Attorney, Thomas Henderson. He lifted his head and looked at the elderly lawyer. His eyes were wide with shock. How is this possible?" he stammered. The entire courtroom held its breath in anticipation. "Does it look familiar, William?" Mr. Henderson asked. His voice was soft, but there was undeniable weight behind it. Robertson flipped through the pages in disbelief. Every word transported him back in time. Back then, he had been a young law student. Talented, ambitious, but falsely accused. A professor had claimed he had committed fraud on an exam. His entire future had been at stake. Everyone had looked at him as if he were guilty. Everyone, except for one person. Thomas Henderson. His eyes welled up, but he swallowed hard to hide it. How did I forget this?" he whispered. Mr. Henderson chuckled lightly. "Power sometimes makes people forget their past." Judge Robertson stared at the file as if it were suffocating him. The entire courtroom was waiting, curious, holding their breath. Even the prosecutor was unsure of what to do. This can't be real," Robertson said, clearing his throat. But the pages didn't lie. He read his own statement from years ago. "I am William Robertson. I am innocent. But no one wants to believe me. My life is over." At the time, he had been poor. He couldn't afford a good lawyer. But someone had volunteered to defend him. And now, that man was sitting right in front of him. He lifted his head and looked at the elderly lawyer in a way he had never looked at anyone before. "Mr. Henderson," he said slowly. The old man smiled slightly. "Do you remember me now?" Robertson could barely breathe. Memories flooded his mind. A small courtroom. A young, terrified boy with all eyes on him. And beside him, a confident voice. This boy is innocent. The man who had spoken those words had been Thomas Henderson. And now, that young boy was a judge, sitting across from the man who had once defended him. Judge Robertson took a deep breath. He clenched his hands, then slowly closed the file in front of him. All eyes in the courtroom were on him. "The court's decision," he began. He hesitated for a moment. He had to do this right. The defendant, Derek Jones, is not guilty. For a few seconds, the courtroom was silent. Then, the room erupted into applause. Derek's eyes filled with tears. His mother wept in the back row. People hugged each other in joy. Derek had just been saved from a life-changing injustice. But this decision didn't just change Derek's life. It changed Judge Robertson, too. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," Judge Robertson said, bowing his head slightly. The elderly lawyer smiled. "I was only doing my job, William. But that job had saved another life." That day in court had been a turning point for Judge Robertson. He thought about it for days. That file, his past, and the truth he had ignored for years reminded him of one thing. Having power means being just. And he had forgotten that. So, the first thing he did was review all his past cases. He wanted to see how many people had been unfairly judged. And then, he made a decision. He wouldn't just be a judge. He would be a defender of justice. To make that happen, he launched a special training program for young lawyers, one focused on defending those falsely accused. On the first day of applications, hundreds of young lawyers stood in front of his courthouse, eager to learn, eager to be like the man who once fought for him. And he had only one message for them. Justice is not served by power alone, but by conscience. One morning, Judge Robertson sat in his office. A letter had been placed on his desk. When he opened the envelope, he found a single sentence inside. "William, I am proud of you. T. Henderson." Robertson held the letter tightly. The man he had once underestimated had actually given him the greatest lesson of all. And now it was his turn to honor that lesson. That day, when Robertson looked in the mirror, he no longer saw just a judge. He saw something else. A warrior of justice,